Monuments and memorials around the country have found new homes. In some cases, at the bottom of rivers, or they've been smashed to pieces or defaced in different ways by protesters calling for revolution. Now, we need to be very careful about what parts of history we censor to avoid repeating that history. That's a part of history, is learning from it. You know, we can't choose our history, and the story, as I've talked about before, the story of the human race is not one of perfection, but it's one of redemption. And our country is a perfect example of that. The president on Friday issued an executive order protecting monuments, statues, and including in this religious properties as well. Joining me now to talk about this is a former congressman from the state of Florida and retired Army Lieutenant Colonel Alan West. Colonel, welcome back to Washington Watch.
Hey, it's good to be with you, Tony. Semper Fi, my friend.
Semper Fi, and I'm glad you're doing well. A lot of people were praying for you after your recent accident, so I'm glad that you are back in the battle.
Absolutely, and thanks so much for your prayers, because without a doubt, I'm a walking miracle, because no one survives a motorcycle accident at 75 miles per hour on the interstate, and I was hit from behind, so I'm very fortunate to be alive.
Well, we are grateful that you are still here and still battling for the things we care deeply about in this country: our freedom, our faith, our families. And, you've made the comment that these acts of lawlessness, it's not lawlessness alone, but there's mindlessness in this as well.
No, it is, without a doubt. And when you look at what is happening, this is the move of anarchists. And we have to stand up and say that we're not going to allow the same thing that the Taliban did in Bamyan province in Afghanistan, or what ISIS did in northern Iraq and also in Syria, to happen here in the United States of America. And I believe that is what people are looking for: the leadership, the resolve, the resiliency of elected officials that will say this is not going to occur. And even here in the great state of Texas, where, I've been calling home for now the last 6 years, we have had to deploy the Texas National Guard to protect the Alamo, one of the great symbols of our fight for independence and freedom, not just in Texas, but in the United States of America. And we have to protect it from these anarchists and from these rioters and looters.
I mean, you made a point, I think, in a recent interview where the history of some of these statues that people are tearing down are actually, from the very ones who are tearing them down, are something for them to celebrate.
Yes, and when I think about what happened with the memorial and the monument to the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, and for those that are listening, that was the unit that was celebrating the movie Glory with Morgan Freeman and Denzel Washington. And so here you have young people going out and saying that they stand for Black Lives Matter and what have you, and they're destroying the monument of the very first black men that served this country in uniform. That to me is an offensive affront to my legacy as a soldier, and also my dad, who served as a soldier in World War II, and my nephew, who's serving right now. So this is not about, a Black Lives Matter or this theme. This is about an ideological agenda to, without a doubt, reimagine, revise, erase the history, the traditions, and the values of the United States of America.
I mean, is this not those coming behind those who have legitimate protests that are out there doing this peacefully and exploiting that and taking it to this level of violence, hiding behind the peaceful protesters, but with an ulterior motive of basically to take down the republic?
Absolutely right. It goes right back to what Rahm Emanuel once said: never let a good crisis go to waste. And so you saw this anarchist group, Antifa, which is a domestic terrorist organization, so I don't know why they're being allowed to operate and raise funds. And then you see an organization that is led by two avowed Marxists, that's Black Lives Matter, taken to the streets. They're promoting a certain ideological agenda, which is really undermining our constitutional republic. I wrote a piece a couple of weeks ago for CNS News, and I just asked the question: does anyone remember George Floyd? Because this has completely been lost in the transaction. And so we had the opportunity to do something about the corruption and the police that were there in Minneapolis, but we've gone beyond that. We're not talking about really what needs to be the big discussion, and I'm sure you'll agree with me, Tony, is the situation in our inner cities that have been created because of the results of the Great Society programs.
Right.
When you have destroyed the black family in these urban settings, this is what you end up having. And this is just, what happened in Minneapolis was just one of the offshoots. But the real problem that we need to have a discussion about is the decimation of the family, the fatherlessness that you see in the black community.
I've got to ask you this, Colonel, because there are folks that agree with every word you have said, but they're afraid to say anything because they'll be labeled a racist. And I ask that to you as a brother, a fellow believer, as a former, as both of us being veterans, two former elected officials. But as a black American, you can say things that as a white can't say. But what would you say to those who are on the sidelines, silent out of fear of being called a racist because they would dare speak up?
Because, Tony, you and I know that on the battlefield, fear paralyzes you. And when you're paralyzed and you're not taking an action, then you get defeated. And that's exactly what is happening here. So if my white brothers and sisters continue to allow themselves to be painted into a corner and paralysis because of fear of being called a name, then that's how you end up losing the country. And white liberal progressive socialists have no problem going into the black communities with their poison. So it's about time that Christian constitutional conservatives find their courage. And as far as I know, the God that we serve, he said in Isaiah 54:17, no weapon formed against you shall prosper, and every tongue that rises against you in judgment you shall condemn.
I rely on that quite frequently. Colonel, thanks so much for joining us. Thank you for your courage. And again, we are so grateful to have you fighting for the things we care about in this country, the things that made this country great. Thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure.